Lilo and Stitch is a masterpiece because of how and where it was made. The live-action Lilo and Stitch hits theaters this weekend, so here are some things I bet you never knew about the 2002 original. The story behind Lilo and Stitch starts in the late 60s in Colorado Springs, where future writer-director Chris Sanders grew up loving comics. As a teen, he borrowed his father's Super 8 film camera and soon became interested in animation when he learned about the camera's single-frame feature. Sanders went to Arvada High School and wanted to take an art class, but when he asked the art teacher to teach him cartooning, the teacher responded, "Comics aren't art." Still, Sanders pursued his passion at CalArts in the famous room A113, which by the way can be seen on numerous license plates in Lilo and Stitch. Anyway, after Sanders graduated CalArts in 1984, he worked as a character designer on Muppet Babies. And around this time, he drew the first version of Stitch, as part of a potential kids book. As he told Vulture, "I wanted to do a children's book about this little creature that lived in a forest. It was a bit of a monster with no real explanation as to where it came from." But he couldn't get the story together and ultimately abandoned the project. Sanders then joined the staff of Walt Disney Feature Animation and worked on Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, and The Lion King before eventually working his way up to head of story on Mulan. In 1997, a number of Disney animation creatives and executives gathered for a retreat at CEO Michael Eisner's farm in Vermont. They were there to brainstorm future films that weren't just adaptations of existing folk stories and novels. VP Thomas Shoemaker wanted them to make Dumbo for our generation, and he believed that Chris Sanders was the guy who could do it. Meanwhile, Disney's animated films were becoming very expensive and not returning at the box office like they had in the early 90s. And so the studio wanted something that could be made on a smaller budget. A year or so after the retreat, Schumacher approached Sanders directly and asked him if there was anything he wanted to develop. He thought back to Stitch and pitched a story about the monster crash landing in a remote forest where he'd have to interact with the local woodland animals. Interestingly, Sanders would later adapt The Wild Robot for the big screen, which has that exact premise. But Shoemaker wasn't sold and instead suggested the monster should be meeting people instead. Quote, "The animal world is already alien to us, so if you want to get the best contrast between this monster and the place where it lives, I would recommend you set it in a human world." Sanders then isolated himself in a hotel room for 3 days and created a 29-page pitch book that included concept art and an outline of the story. At first, Stitch was going to meet a human boy character, but then Sanders realized that Stitch already gave off young male energy, so he thought the character would be better balanced with a little girl. Sanders also thought back to a recent vacation in Hawaii and thought it would be perfect as the film's setting. He looked at a map of Hawaii and soon found Lilo Lane and Nani on the map. Sanders later said, "Animation has been so much in ancient medieval Europe. So many fairy tales find their roots there. That to place this movie in Hawaii was kind of a big leap, but that choice went to color the entire movie." Tom Shoemaker liked the pitch and gave it a green light, but he had one requirement. The movie had to look like Chris Sanders drew it. Sanders then brought on Dean DuBois, a former collaborator from Mulan, and Disney's upper management mostly left them alone when they were writing the script and developing the movie. Originally, Stitch was going to be a member of an intergalactic gang, and Jumbo was one of his henchmen who the council hired to capture him. But test audiences rejected this plot, and so they changed it to Stitch being Jumbo's creation. The creative team visited Kauai on a research trip to learn about its culture, and it was there that they became familiar with the concept of ohana. DuBois explained, "No matter where we went, our tour guide seemed to know somebody. He was really the one who explained to us the Hawaiian concept of ohana, a sense of family that extends far beyond your immediate relatives." Sanders said the film's artists spent some time in Hawaii as well, painting the landscapes to get a feel for the environments, and they paid very close attention to detail, like the pink sea foam, for example. Andreas Deja, the supervising animator for the Lilo character, even visited a school in Hawaii to meet local children and see how they behaved. The filmmakers then cast Hawaiian actors to keep things authentic. Honolulu native Tia Carrere, best known for Wayne's World, played Nani. She had auditioned for Mulan, but lost the role to Ming-Na Wen. Carrere then recommended Jason Scott Lee, who's of Hawaiian descent and grew up in Hawaii, for David. They both helped rewrite their characters' dialogue to sound realistic, and they even added in some Hawaiian slang. Davy Chase, meanwhile, beat out 150 other girls for the part of Lilo. She was 8 years old when she was cast, and is now 34 years old. Tia Carrere and Davy Chase never met each other until the movie's premiere. Chase would go on to play the girl in The Ring and appear in Donnie Darko. Stitch was originally going to be a non-verbal character, but then they realized for the sake of the story he had to say a couple of things. They thought eventually they'd do some stunt casting for the part and hire someone like Danny DeVito. In the meantime, director Chris Sanders provided the scratch tracks with a voice he used just to bother people at the studio. Quote, "I'd call people on the phone and do that voice and annoy them." DuBois said eventually the pictures married so well with the voice that Chris became the official voice of Stitch. Bubbles was originally going to be a nerdy guy, and they offered Jeff Goldblum the role. He turned it down, so they reimagined the character to be more intimidating. The directors remembered Ving Rhames in Pulp Fiction and offered him the part. Ricardo Montalban was originally in the cast, doing his Khan voice, but his character was eventually cut from the film when they 86'd the gang storyline. Disney set the budget at $80 million and mandated that they make the movie at the studio's Florida offices, which was fine by the directors because it meant they could make it in isolation, essentially, away from the executives and CEO Michael Eisner. DuBois told Vulture this film would be made off the grid grid away from the watchful eyes of the Disney leadership. Sanders said, "We were the equivalent of a spy plane that was being built at a secret hangar with a very elite group of people." And that's another reason that Florida was magic, because no one knew what was going on in Florida. And this allowed them to make a lot of unique and different choices away from the regular Disney movies. One unique decision Sanders and Dubois made was to use watercolor paint backgrounds. Watercolors were used early on in Disney movies like Snow White, Pinocchio, and Dumbo, but were abandoned in the mid-40s for being too complicated. Sanders brought them back for Lilo and Stitch to evoke the bright colors of a storybook, as well as the design style of Dumbo. But this meant training artists on how to do it. The background artists took watercolor workshops for 7 months, and they even met with and learned from one of the background artists on Snow White, who was still alive. Disney was slowly using more 3D animation in its movies at this time, but because of Lilo and Stitch's smaller budget, it was done completely in 2D. And throwing back to Tom Shoemaker's mandate, the characters themselves were based on Sanders' personal drawing style rather than the traditional in-house Disney style. And if you've ever wondered why some of the character animations look simplistic, it's because it had to do with budget constraints. They couldn't add details like pockets or complicated patterns on the clothes because that would have required shadowing. The movie's aliens and spaceships were intentionally designed to evoke marine life. But maybe the most famous behind-the-scenes story about Lilo and Stitch is the 9/11 edit. You see, the film's climactic air chase originally had Stitch, Nani, Jumba, and Pleakley hijacking a commercial airplane from the airport in Hawaii, which they then used to chase Gantu, who had kidnapped Lilo. During this flight scene, the 747 even scraped against buildings in downtown Honolulu. But then, with just a few weeks left in production, 9/11 happened, and so the filmmakers completely remade the scene to have them flying Jumba's ship instead, and relocated the flight to the mountains rather than the city. Sanders says Jumba's ship has 747-style jet engines because they were left over from the original version. But even after those changes, they had a little bit of budget left to make the epilogue montage. Production on Lilo and Stitch then wrapped in late 2001. Chris Sanders was a huge Elvis fan and always wanted Elvis music in the movie, but they weren't sure they'd be able to secure the rights. So they ended up showing some early material to the Elvis estate, who loved it and approved use of Elvis's songs. Because they made the movie across the country, CEO Michael Eisner didn't see it until it was done. Sanders recalled that before they showed it to Michael Eisner, everybody was nervous, like, oh my god, we made a film and we never told Michael Eisner. But Eisner approved. He said, "Chris, Dean, I really like this. I like it. I can't really explain it. I've never seen anything like it, but I like it. It's just so hard to explain, but I really like it." But meanwhile, the Disney marketing department was apparently worried the movie wouldn't sell because it wasn't computer animated. That said, Lilo and Stitch went on to have a really unique marketing campaign that leaned into Stitch's disruptive behavior. They created 4 teaser trailers showing Stitch invading iconic moments in Disney's early 90s hits. To spread the word about the movie's use of watercolors, they held a watercolor workshop for 500 journalists at Cannes in 2002, where they taught them how to paint. Disney also created some prequel comics that ran in the Disney Adventures magazine, and then Lilo and Stitch opened on 3,191 screens in the US on June 21st, 2002. It did $35 million opening weekend, falling to number 2 behind Minority Report. But the movie had legs and ended up grossing $273 million worldwide, more than 3 times its budget. Critics really like Lilo and Stitch. Today, 86% of the 151 reviews assessed by Rotten Tomatoes are positive. And then the movie was a massive hit on DVD. On its first day, it sold 3 million copies, earning $45 million in retail sales. It was nominated for Best Animated Feature at the Oscars, but lost to Spirited Away. Disney actually edited one scene post-release. In the original film, Lilo hides in the family's dryer, but now on Disney Plus, the dryer door is a pizza box, as to not encourage kids to play in the dryer. The movie spawned 3 tie-in video games in 2002, while the characters would appear in numerous Disney game franchises like Kingdom Hearts and Disney Infinity for decades to come. In 2004, Disney World rethemed its very frightening alien encounter attraction around Stitch, which made it funnier and more family-friendly. That attraction ran until 2018 and then closed, and to this day it sits abandoned within the Magic Kingdom. The movie spawned direct-to-video sequels and spin-off series. First, there was the 2003 straight-to-video sequel Stitch the Movie, which also served as the pilot for Lilo and Stitch the series, which ran on ABC and the Disney Channel for 65 episodes from 2003 to 2006. It then ended with the TV movie Leroy and Stitch. But while that was going on, Disney also made the 2005 direct-to-video sequel Lilo and Stitch 2, Stitch Has a Glitch, and an animated series simply called Stitch ran in Japan from 2008 to 2011. And then in 2018, we learned Disney was making a live-action adaptation of Lilo and Stitch. John Chu was originally in talks to direct, but then Dean Fleischer Camp eventually took over. And after 7 years, the movie finally made its way to the big screen in May 2025. And if you've made it to the end of this video, drop an Ohana in the comments.